All right. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming and being here and sharing this virtual space with me and Cassie. Um, Before we jump into the talk, I just want to take a moment to introduce Cassie um, and to say a few thank yous. So, Cassie is an arts writer who is based in New York. She's also a mom to the cutest dog that I possibly have ever met, named Beckett after the one and only Samuel Beckett. And she has bylines in publications at Art Forum, Bomb, Freeze, LA Review of Books, and Vice, and she's a regular contributor to Hyperallergic with a weekly column on the art market and a monthly column on restitution, which is very important. Thank you for doing that work. And Cassie is going to be joining me in a conversation about the work that we're going to look at together after I give a brief presentation of the show. And I invited Cassie, because I really respect her. I think she's extravagantly smart. And she's also someone that I really trust with the contents of my work. And so I'm really grateful for you to be here tonight. And before I jump in, I just want to say a few thank yous to some of my teachers prior to Rutgers that have made big impacts on me: Joanne Greenbaum, Patricia Tribe, and Franklin Evans, as well as my Rutgers faculty that I've worked with: Mark Handelman, Hanalina Roegberg, Didier Williams, Natalie Bookchin, Stephen Westfall, Park MacArthur, and Miranda Lichtenstein. I also want to thank my Skowhegan family, my Cooper Union family, who is here tonight and has supported me through making all of this work, and for my chosen family, Kyle Bicot, Susie, Celeste Sousa, Cedric Chisholm, Sue Sacco, Philip Goufler, and so many others that I'm forgetting right now. And last but not least, my trans healthcare doctor, Lynn Fryer, for being an angel amidst the medical industrial complex. So on that note, I'm going to jump into the work. So the title of my thesis exhibition is At Your Touch. And this body of work really focuses and stems out of research and time I've spent with the archive, mostly of paintings and poems made by Reed Erickson. And so I actually I met Reed when I was at Skowhegan. I read a brief blurb in a book that mentioned Reed, and it mentioned that he was transgender, that he was a philanthropist, and that he had a life partner who was a leopard named Henry. And with those very sensational facts, I was intrigued and wanted to learn more about who this trans man in history was, just in general. And, a lot of the history that you first come across when you learn about Reed is the sensational facts. Reed had an addiction to cocaine and other psychedelics. He funded a lot of New Age spiritual movement research. He funded dolphin human communication research. He married 3 times, and he moved his second wife and their 2 children into a mansion he built in Mexico called the Love Joy Peace Ashram. And he did end up adopting a leopard that he named Henry, who he saw as his protector and partner. And so, all of these facts are incredibly juicy and incredibly sensational. But the more that I really started to look into Reed's history, the more I learned that these sensational facts are actually um, probably not the most impressive aspects of who he was and the work that he did. And so that's where a lot of my research is focusing. So Reed made a huge and main accomplishment in his life. His family owned a lead smelting business that he inherited in the early 60s. And after he inherited that, the next year he began working with Dr. Harry Benjamin, who helped him transition medically. And he was in part able to do that because through inheriting the family business and through his own commercial endeavors, he garnered what would today be worth over $40 million. So he had a huge amount of wealth and class privilege that allowed him to not only transition at a time when transitioning medically wasn't unheard of, but was incredibly rare. And he went farther and he was able to create the EEF. And the EEF was the Erickson Educational Foundation. And the foundation's goal was to provide assistance and support in areas where human potential was limited by adverse physical, mental, or social conditions, or where the scope of research was too new, controversial, or imaginative to receive traditionally oriented support. And that's a huge statement. For the most part, the foundation funded projects and research and centers focused around trans healthcare. But under that definition for the foundation, it becomes very obvious that Reed saw trans healthcare as something that was almost so imaginative, just being trans in this period of time. You know, it was such a leap of imagination for his time. And, you know, one can argue that it still is today. And so the EEF did a lot of incredible work. They made pamphlets that went out to very specific groups of people. So they would send out pamphlets to doctors on how to treat transgender patients. They would send out a pamphlet that they have for law enforcement officers, asking the most frequently asked questions about transgender people that law enforcement officers asked, and gave them instructions on how to better interact with transgender people. They gave pamphlets out to mental health professionals and religious leaders that helped combat the stigmas that are present in those two communities against transgender people. And these pamphlets were also sent to transgender people in rural areas and in heavily populated areas. So the EEF was not only creating very localized, you know, opportunities for people to learn about transness, it really was this overarching and widespread work across America and North America largely that the foundation was doing. And one of the main uh, projects that is of interest to me that the EEF funded was Dr. Benjamin's work, which became the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And what this was basically Harry Benjamin's, you know, thesis, his standards for trans healthcare and what that would look like. And today, that actual work by Henry Benjamin has evolved into what we now call WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is actually the guidelines that most trans healthcare professionals still abide by today. So across, you know, overall the transgender healthcare system that we have today, it is deeply embedded with thanks to Reed's generosity to extend his class privilege beyond his own ability to transition, but to extend it to create opportunities for other people to transition and for transgender people to be accepted more widely. And to me, that is an incredible and inspiring legacy. And so now I'm just going to read a bit from this statement that I've written. One can argue that Reed's poor life choices and mental health result from who Erickson was as a person. But one may also say that they are side effects of living in an extravagantly transphobic world. Though Erickson lived in a different time than myself, I am consistently blown away by the paintings and poems he created towards the end of his life, which showcase an extremely relatable inner life, one that is frustrated, fiery, illegible, beautiful, existential, and lonely. Today, 40% of transgender people will have attempted suicide in their lifetime. I don't think it is too far off to say that Reed's angsty artistic creations reflect a poetic and depressed state many transgender people still experience today. Erickson believed that transitioning was not only a process of the body, but a process of changing one's mental, emotional, and spiritual life, that it is a process that requires imagination and support. The artworks in this exhibition attempt to showcase the mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of my transgender friends and I's transitions. In the series, At Your Touch, I borrow Reed's language from one of his poems to create a 10-part drawing series illustrating complex portraits of people in transition. And in the group of Eli Educational Foundation drawings, I borrowed the visual language of Reed's poems, which he wrote on EEF letterhead or a fake medical pad that he made, to create the series of works that elevate personal truths and poems with the aesthetics of an institutional voice. And in the painting Yellow But Trans, I create an image of myself mixed with that of Coldplay's front singer Chris Martin, a man whose image sparked my thoughts of longing to be a part of a gender I was not assigned to at birth. In many of Erickson's poems, he addresses God, and I cannot help but read God in these works as Reed speaking to himself. Every day, trans people imagine a reality but on the one we live in and work towards creating a new world for themselves. Religion often explains elements of life that we do not have logic for. But in the everyday life of trans people and Erickson's poetry, I see transgender people blooming despite a transphobic world telling them that they are illegible and illogical and therefore dangerous. When I read Erickson's words, fill my testosterone prescription, and create artwork with a body I have made, I cannot help but think, thank God I'm trans. These are some of the drawings and poems that I am referencing throughout the show. The image to the right is one of the poems written on the fake medical pad, and the poem to the left is written on the Erickson Educational Foundation letterhead. So this is an install image from the show of the Eli Educational Foundation drawings. And as you can see, I've created a letterhead that these drawings exist on. They're prints, the butterflies, and the borders are made with ink, and the inside drawings are made with pen. And they're 13 by 19, about the size of a large document. And in these drawings, much like Reed's extremely personal and frantic and urgent poetry that he's written on his institutional letterhead, I really tried to get into the rhythm and the groove that I feel from Reed's poems on these pieces of institutional paper, and to get in the studio and in moments of frustration or urgency or slowness to fill the page with whatever is there. And so, much like how Reed's archive becomes an emotional log, a log of affect for what it was like to be a trans man in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I feel extremely excited by thinking of these drawings as my own kind of documentation of what it's like to be a trans man now. And the interest for me, is overall in working with Reed is how much our narratives, I feel, still overlap. And there's a beauty to that and feeling connected to trans elders. And there's also some grief in that some aspects of being trans that might be more difficult psychologically or physically or are still there and present today. And you can see in some of the poems, if you're reading them too, that much like Reed, I am also grappling with this idea of the divine, of the maker, of a godlike figure, of a poetic figure, you might say, that fills in the space of not understanding. And I'll read a few of these out loud. The first is, gorgeous man in the mirror, God wants to get a hold on you. Will you ever pick up the phone? Tell him, yes, I've changed. Oh, what is changing? Well, the sunlight, the sleep, the leaves, the blossoms, the sheep, the weather, the skin, the water, the muscle, the texture, the shoreline, the hairline, the contour, the rain, the speed, the width, the breath, the sweat, the script, the length, the heart, the dose, the harmony, the line, the tears, the blood, the face, the wind, the heat, the greeting, the faith, the fat, the dirt, and more. It was the last week of January. I was on my knees before him. He was the most luminous boy I'd ever met. His crystal watched my hands, flicking the bubbles inside the plastic. His eyes followed my hands, guiding the needle into his thigh. It was the wrong size. The doctor forgot. So he got one from a friend. I can see him still, wincing in pain at the size, how felt it was. Every time we got closer to cooling the knowledge in our hearts, every Sunday night. The wind lifts the head of my scarf, and it becomes a snake. Its eyes of fringe and lips of green slowly start to shake. As the body of a velvet glove comes swinging into view. But scarf is not the only prey. You see, the glove is too. The blood drains out of the velvet hand as its stomach turns and flips. Glove tells itself, come on, man, you've got to get a grip. These creatures of comfort and enemies of other barely get the time to rip each other's seams apart before their owners pass and the wind whispers goodbye. So here's a farther away view of the EEF drawings that lead into what you might say is one of the main bodies of work in the show, which is the At Your Touch drawings. And so this series of drawings, these 10 drawings, were made and started with, a looser framework than I may be used to of saying, okay, I know I want to make 10 drawings where on each page, one line from one of Reed's poems sits within the composition. I want the text to fall down the page parallel to how the lines fall down the page that Reed has written the poem on. And I want to put in images that feel like personal records, that feel also like portraits of myself and my friends in moments of transition, literally, figuratively, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, for the most part, in terms of gender, but to try to create a series of drawings where in each one, I go in with the intention that I'm going to create a trans person in this work. And I'm going to deal with how to represent a trans person in my drawing. And for me, this poem felt like a standout, in part because the you, much like how I see the God operating in Reed's poems, feels like Reed speaking to a younger version of himself. The script in the poem is extremely aesthetically appealing to me. The way you feel his urgency increasing as he writes down the page, and there's a real emotional tie between the words that are written and the way that they're written. And for me, that felt like the perfect subject to take on. I started the drawings with this image of my friend Philip, who I met at Skowhegan. We became close friends over a project Philip was making on a transgender pop star who passed away, Lana Kaiser. And we also bonded over drag and dressing up together and encouraging one another's gender fluidity. And it felt extremely appropriate to me to begin the series with someone who I have an open relationship with in terms of gender in our friendship, and who I know is comfortable with me portraying them. I've worked with Philip a lot. I joke that they're my muse sometimes over the past year. And Philip appears a couple times in the series. And so I was making these drawings. I was thinking a lot about the idea of trans propagation and what does that term mean to me? And for me, it evolved into two ideas. The first is in the images, literally propagating trans bodies to exist in space within my drawings. It became evident to me over the course of making images of transgender people that are obscured and not easily recognizable and not easily readable and not easily consumable, that viewers viewers might very well still go into my work wanting to gender the bodies, but if you are, you're really missing out on the actual beauty in the drawings. And there's a certain kind of liberation for me in propagating trans bodies to exist in space that are not affected by people's reading of them. This figure will hold the same pose whether or not it's misgendered by an audience. This figure, these trans bodies will not cave in and try to explain themselves in a different way. There's a certain power of solidity in the stagnant image of the figure and in having it almost frozen in a moment of being obscured by the clothing, by the chiaroscuro. And there's a glamour to being unrecognizable in these works where the illegibility of their gender becomes a powerful, I think, and sexy element to the drawings. And so the second idea of trans propagation for me in making these works was also kind of confronting this very cliche and cheesy symbol of the butterfly. I can't even say it without laughing. But for me, the butterfly is, I hate it, but I love it so much. And the fact that I love it despite kind of hating it only makes me love it more. This very basic idea, this very binary symbol of the caterpillar into the butterfly, and this A to B process. In actuality, that's almost no trans person's experience from those that I've talked to or met. Being trans is, to me, a refusal of singularity and oftentimes linearity. And for me, going into these works, I was thinking about how I could think about the symbol of the butterfly as more of this lush and, um, you know, image of like a sustainable form of gender, where, all monarchs or a lot of butterflies need to survive is milkweed. It's this one plant, it's very simple, it grows pretty easily if you don't mess with it, and it prospers and it thrives. And if you just give it what it needs, it grows. And to me, that became this really gorgeous metaphor for helping trans people exist in space. If only transness and was as easy to propagate as planting one plant. Um, Unfortunately, it's not a plant that often helps trans people thrive. It's a health system that's broken. It's a socioeconomic system that's geared against people who are illegible, and especially for trans people of color, and if it was as simple as, you know, giving them this one thing they need. And in this drawing space that I'm creating, the bodies can just exist. The only thing they need is for me to propagate them. And I love this picture plane broken apart between the text and the still body, and the symbol of the butterfly, you know, refusing to sit in the single plane. And yet, these three various elements of the drawing exist in the same world, just not in the same plane. There's a there's something to admire and look up to in that framework for me. And, in general, these drawings were extremely pleasurable for me to make, to be quite honest. They're all charcoal. They're 24 by 36, which is the size of a typical poster. And so this, again, really, the series of drawings for me got to really taking on head on this double-edged sword of how trans people are represented right now. It's often said that trans people are experiencing a tipping point of visibility, which is in part true, but oftentimes it's trans people that adhere to a very binary understanding of gender. It's people who are very class privileged. And when those are the images that exist in the world, that becomes the definition of transness. And so anyone who exists outside of those binary and socially and economically affluent models is still not given space in the world. And for me, again, there's a certain power to making images of trans people that aren't easily consumable, that aren't easily fallen into a binary, or, that exist in spaces outside of just their class privilege. They exist, in their spiritual space. They exist within, a space of growth. They exist within a feeling of their sexuality, and without, you know, being used just for their image. I like to think that the figures in my drawings exist within an entire emotional and mental and physical world, and not just a flattened image for consumption. So for me, making the poster sized images, this, size that calls to reproducibility and mass, you know, mass reproduction, and filling that space of popularity with images that are hard to recognize and maybe wouldn't be so easily popular, was a fantastic and fun challenge to take on. And I don't know, I can only hope that some of you all also find some pleasure or relief or play or great sense of nuance in these works. So the last piece I'll touch on in the show is this self-portrait, and it is titled Yellow But Trans. And it starts here. This is a photo of the beach by the house where I grew up. I'm from Port Huron, Michigan, which is a low-income, small suburban town outside of Detroit. And oftentimes this space, specifically this beach, was a space I would go to and have my angsty tween thoughts, classic looking out at the water, thinking about my life, the beginning of existential turmoil. And, as imagery of the shore often is, this space and this image that I spent so much time inside of was a space of contemplation and becoming for me, as was the music video Yellow by Coldplay, and more specifically and in general, the man and front singer for Coldplay, Chris Martin, who was not necessarily like my celebrity crush growing up. It was more of a, I want your haircut, I want your clothes, I want your face, I want to be you. Why do I want to be you? Why do I want to stare at you? It was a gender crush for sure. And it was one of the first moments where it started to fall into place, or the questions started popping up, was seeing this image of Chris. And, this is a painting maybe a bit more playful or humorous than things I usually make. Um, but it felt like an appropriate time to make this painting that I've thought about making. And so, yes, I created this painting, which is if Chris Martin and I had a love child of our bodies and our beaches and our existential crises. And it is titled Yellow But Trans. Again, I love this piece in part because it's such a ridiculous prompt. I'm very aware of that. But as I made the painting, it became more evident to me, again, the intelligence in humor or in irony sometimes, making this painting out of sarcasm at my younger self evolved into this painting that really feels more like a tribute or hug to my younger self. And since making it, I feel like every artist should give themselves that challenge to make something for their 13-year-old self, because it's a moment, it's a mood, it's a time, it's a thing to do, you know, have fun. So yeah, that's the walk around of the show space. And before I go into my talk with Cassie, I just want to throw out there that these two posters, the image to the right here, and this poster of Reed with my prints over top, are both. I'm making print series of them for friends for pretty cheap on my website. So if you're a poor trans person watching this, I want you to know that this work is for you, and it feels really important to me that my friends and the people that this work might touch the most, have access to it. So if you are interested, sliding scale, message me. I love you all. Thank you. And yeah, we're going to jump into the talk with Cassie now.
just learned so much from that. And thanks for the invitation to be here tonight and for making this body of work that's just so generous and thoughtful and vulnerable. Big fan over here.
You. Thank you, Cassie. It means a lot coming from you.
Of course. So how was it putting together this show during the pandemic?
I can't. No, it was a real moment. I thought about this a lot, obviously, as we all have thought about making during the pandemic. And I almost feel bad saying this, but not a lot changed for me in making the show during the pandemic. I am a Taurus. I spend a lot of time alone in my studio anyways. And also during my transition, I spend a lot of time inside. It's not a super fun experience for me to be out and about in New Brunswick, New Jersey as a gender non-conforming person. And so again, joke, not joke that my life really hasn't changed, including my making since the pandemic. I think more than anything, I've been just feeling really grateful to be an artist during the pandemic because it isn't that far of a change from my everyday life.
Right.
You know?
And you're still teaching, right? So you've still kind of had your artist community around you.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm in grad school, which has been amazing because I'm still surrounded by conversations on art, and I'm also teaching, which makes me feel connected to the world and think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
Yeah. So with the amazing archive that you worked with, I looked into it a little bit, and I guess it's the only one of its kind in that it's trans specific. This is the Transgender Archive at the University of Victoria, where all of Reed's things are. And I was curious about your relationship with these queer archives. I noticed that in the past, you've also worked with queer archives, like within larger institutions. Last year, when I was at your show at ZH Projects, you had those works about lesbian motorcycle gangs, which had all this material like culled from Harvard archives and the Her Story archives, of course. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what appeals to you about working in this mode, like starting from this endpoint of the archive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a super important question to my work overall. I think working with archives and more generally working with queer history is kind of this touchstone that I find myself coming back to between projects. And also, I think that, most artists I know have a few questions or phenomena that they kind of inescapable, they can't escape from circling around in their practice. And I think a big one for me is the experience of grounding myself in the world outside of a, nuclear family structure. I, don't come from a super tight or supportive family. My family is chosen as a queer person, as a trans person. And for me, going through archival material is a way of building a trans family tree, which is a very grounding and validating process. And so, when I was making the work with the lesbian motorcycle groups, a lot of that was being able to spend days and weeks in these archives and just going through images of butch women, of women who might later transition in life, of women who built a culture around their butchness, and being able to almost relish in that self-reflection. And it's a similar process with Reed for me. I think one that's even more personal. So yeah, the archive it's a mirror, and I'm very narcissistic.
Yeah, I'm curious about how that relationship with Reed is different, because it's so clear to me, just having seen that work and then seeing this work, that in some way you were starting to kind of fuse with Reed, or your identities were being blurred, they kind of became porous. There's even with the Eli Educational Foundation pieces, which I'm a big fan of, unsurprisingly. Um, there's this sort of aggressive act of putting your name on Reed Erickson's letterhead and his poems, while on top of it borrowing his visual vernacular. So I'm just curious about that relationship that you've developed with Reed through the archive, that's clearly so personal, and kind of how that dynamic developed and where you're at now.
Yes, that is all like a really good way to put it. I sometimes my relationship with historical figures, um, it feels like a like almost like a one-sided relationship structure where it's like, I feel incredibly seen by these people, but that doesn't mean that I understand them. They understand me, or I feel understood by them, but I don't understand who they are. I'll never get to know them. Like, I'm the progeny of these people that I'll never meet and never truly understand. And so there's, I think, kind of like an admittance, like me admitting to that, as in a sense, and how I will write over or just steal, borrow, whatever you want to call it, from Reed's archive, whether it be the actual text or the visual language. I think the way that I use it does border on appropriation and admiration, but I do feel entitled to this history. I feel like it is my own history, which for me takes it more into an area of less of appropriation and more of admiration. I think in a way it just, I mean, this is like a little hippy dippy to say, but I think it feels more of like a spiritual meeting with Reed when
Yeah.
I borrow his elements, where, it seems very clear I create this psychological thing in my head where, I'm sure Reed would have really liked to have met a lot of other trans men or myself. And in my work, it is this kind of area for us to meet and to share a space with one another.
Yeah, totally. There's something really nice in that, and this is coming from my position as a cisgender person, so let me know
Yeah.
if flop. But just that in so much trans representation, there's like this fetishizing of the I and of the narrative autobiography and the trauma of that. And instead, you've kind of made a space that, like you say, is shared, it's collective, it's a we, and there's something really powerful and wonderful in that.
Yes. Yes. Like, underscore. I feel so incredibly devoted to creating, I mean, in my real life, I love creating community and queer community spaces, but more in general, I dream for the day when trans people aren't united through their trauma and that we are viewed as a community because of our shared joy and our shared experiences in a positive way. I think you know, it's healing when others have experienced your pain in a way that is so close to your own experience. But I think it's incredibly more powerful when you can celebrate each other's joy. And for me, that also has to do um, with this term, trans poetics a bit, where I often use it, or I've come to use it to describe my work over the past year, and that it's engaging in trans poetics. And what that means to me is, if you take poetics, which is aesthetic and political, and you combine that with transness, trans poetics to me becomes this space where it reeks of, saying no to any singularity that is aesthetic or political. And it, in negating singularity politically and aesthetically, it calls for multiplicity and community. And it's important to me that that multiplicity and community is created more over joy than pain.
Right. Right. It's really well put. And there's a mobility in that as well, because like in multiplicity, there's a sort of slipperiness. And that's something that I see you doing with, and in general with like the queer turn towards the archival, is going into this space that seems like it's where history ends or closes, and instead making work as a kind of radical reading of that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the titles of my shows have to do with like touching or handling or like a bodily thing. And I think it's just in part for me because going into these archives feels like such a personal, sometimes erotic, sometimes just validating, but it feels like a real physical experience.
Yeah. I mean, your body's so present there.
Yes, so much mindfulness.
Much mindfulness. I'm curious about this. So this kind of is at the heart of questions about like trans visibility and trans representation, but I'm curious about this idea of legibility that you've brought up a few times, and I was wondering if you could expand a bit on that.
Yes, that's also really important to the work. Like when I was at Skowhegan, which is the most amazing place, and this is not to throw shade on it, but I did have, like one studio visit where I made a painting of Philip, and they were kind of coming out of the darkness, and you could just see their shoulders and an arm. And my stake in this, studio visit was, talking about, perception and losing one's sense of themselves in space. And the studio visit ended up being almost an argument because this person couldn't get past my statement that the body in my painting wasn't gendered. And they, pointed at the arm muscle and they were like, but that's a man's arm. Mm-hmm. And to me, that just put into perspective how important it was, such a drive it put in me to like make images where it is illegible, and that's not to say that I won't put a muscular arm in my work. If you want to gender my bodies based on those kinds of specificities, you can. But there is a certain refusal to be easily recognized, easily consumed, easily gendered, and making the bodies, slip in and out of light and dark with the chiaroscuro, to be, in a space of growth and kind of obscured by the garden, to be turning away in most of the drawings, their face from the viewer. There's a real attitude of refusal, and, giving the viewer a hard time about so easily consuming them.
Right. And that's kind of similar to something you said at one point about Reed's poems as well, that they're kind of a refusal, like there's a refusal built in there. They're very difficult to read and they kind of have a punk aesthetic.
Yes, I think that punk is like the number one term I would apply to why I love Reed. Like his he's neurotic, he's imagining far outside of our capitalist structures. But you're right, like even the poems are either literally illegible because of the handwriting, or they're illegible in their concept because they make almost no sense. And there's just a beauty to me in loving them and relishing and rolling around in them despite not understanding like what the fuck they're saying.
Right. I mean, he esoteric person.
Yeah. Yeah.
The little bit on dolphin communication is pretty fantastic. I love that.
It's amazing. He believed in realms far outside of the ones we exist in. I only aspire to be that spiritually woke one day.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, is that part of the appeal?
Oh my God,
The
definitely.
spiritualism of it and the
Definitely, yeah, like the mysticism, the mythology around him. It's always with the archive, part of the appeal is that you get to imagine and fill in the blanks and daydream. That's such a sexy process. And with Reed being such an extravagant person, it just makes that filling in the blanks part so much more fun.
oh my gosh, I love that.
Yes.
It makes me want to book it to the archive, you know?
I highly recommend. As soon as the pandemic's over, Vancouver, here we come.
And they've digitized a lot of it, right?
Yeah, actually, I got the images that I printed out of the phone in the show off of like this librarian, and I got into an email exchange. And then they ended up just taking like cell phone photos of everything for me. All of those photos are just iPhone pics from this librarian. But some of the documents, such as the pamphlets that the EEF made, are digitized, which is nice.
Yeah. I like that. That's kind of guerrilla archive research.
Oh yeah, gotta push through those institutional barriers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that goes back to a fundamental question. It's if you have this radical archive, but it's in an institution, and what if someone has to show identification they're not comfortable with, you
Yeah.
know? What if you have to pay? So it seems like you circumvented that pretty well.
Yes, I hate privatized archives with a burning passion.
Yeah,
Yes.
feel that. But then our documentation is scarce. Um,
So, did you have any more questions, Cassie, or should we?
I think we're probably at a good place to stop now that everyone is really excited to run to the archives.
I know, exactly. I think so too.